Okay, it is 12 noon, so we're going to go ahead and get started this afternoon. Again, thank you all for joining us. My name is Danielle Davis, and I'll be coordinating things on the back end of the event. So if you have any questions at any time, please feel free to place them in the chat box at the bottom of your screen or in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and I will be happy to assist you. So for those that are new to the Michigan Alzheimer's Disease Research Center, we're a center here in Ann Arbor and a collaboration between the University of Michigan, Wayne State, Michigan, and Michigan State University. So we offer a variety of dementia-related research studies, and if you're interested in learning more about our wellness program for caregiver, Lewy body dementia support groups, or if you want to get involved with research yourself, then feel free to visit our website, our social media site, or reach out to me and I can point you in the right direction. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Amanda Leggett. Dr. Leggett's health services research focuses primarily on caregivers of individuals with dementia. Specifically, she examines caregiver style of care management and how those styles are associated with health services utilization for their care recipient with dementia and themselves. So, without further ado, if you could all join me, let's welcome Dr. Amanda Leggett. Oh, I'm sorry. Hold on 1 second, Dr. Leggett. Also, one thing I want to point out, we do have an evaluation. I'm going to place the link for the evaluation in our chat box towards the end of the presentation. So if everyone could fill that out, that would be helpful. And then you'll also receive that information in an email. So there will be time for questions at the end, and we'll review the questions at the end, and there'll be a link for the evaluation. So go ahead, take it away.
Thank you so much, Danielle. And hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Happy lunchtime. I'm really honored that you would spend your lunch hour here with me today to learn a little bit about my research on caregiving styles. And I will explain exactly what I mean by that to you in case you've never heard that terminology before. But first, before I begin and get started, I would like to share some acknowledgements first for the funding of my research that I'll be sharing with you today, which comes from the National Institute on Aging. I have a Career Development Award and related supplement to that award that funds the work. And I have an incredible team of mentors and colleagues who have supported this study from the idea of it through now the seeing through of the research. And this team is across the country. So here at Michigan, but as far west as California and as far east, I believe, as Pennsylvania. So very grateful for this wonderful team, and also my fabulous research assistants that have helped me with this project, some of whom you see pictured here. One thing I'm really grateful for is I've had a lot of undergraduates working with me on this work who are interested in medical school or graduate school. And so kind of getting their feet wet and hopefully gaining understanding of dementia and caregiving that they will take with them into their careers. So first, before I get into the actual work, I want to start with a case study for you. And I would like you to keep this in mind as I go through my presentation today. So here's the case for you. Frank is an 86-year-old man living with dementia, and he insists that his grandson Kevin is stealing from him and gets combative when Kevin comes to visit. He throws a pillow across the room when Kevin enters. So I'm going to give you a variety of responses that someone might make given this situation. And I'd like you to think about which of these responses best reflects how you might manage this situation if confronted with it. So first, you go to pick up the pillow and take it back to Frank. You've taken all of Frank's care on your shoulders and seem to take care of things without getting too emotionally involved. You tell Frank that Kevin didn't steal anything from him and start a separate conversation with Kevin. Or maybe your option B. You remember this happening last month and that trying to reason with Frank didn't work. So instead, you try to dissipate the situation by telling Frank that you and Kevin are going to the kitchen to make a snack. And you use that snack as a diversion for Frank. In the kitchen, you suggest to Kevin that it might be better to prevent this from happening in the future by visiting Kevin at his house rather than him coming to you. You're not worried, and you know you'll be able to figure out a solution if this strategy doesn't work. Or might you be option C? You are frustrated when Frank, again accuses Kevin. Kevin is a wonderful grandson, and you just don't understand why Frank keeps reacting this way. You tell Frank that Kevin would never steal from him and that he needs to stop lying and go pick up the pillow. You begin to feel your blood pressure going up and are not sure how much more of this behavior you can take. Option D, you exclaim, "What? What did he steal from you?" And then immediately you feel guilty for your reaction as you realize the dementia is impacting his beliefs. But when Frank can't give you a response for what was stolen, you feel helpless and don't know what to do. You try to trial and error some solutions, but you keep getting stuck and you wish you had some support for how to handle this situation. And finally, what about option E? Maybe this is you. You go to comfort Frank and rub his back to help him calm down. You think about how stressed you would be if you thought someone was stealing from you and try your best to empathize with Frank. You tell him that you remember seeing the stolen item and suggest that you look for it together, including Kevin in the search. Okay, so this gives you a very brief intro into how I think about caregiving styles, and I'll explain more about this concept in just a little bit, but think about what response you selected and why. Like, what was it about that response that you think most aligns with how you would handle that situation if confronted with it? And maybe carry that thinking forward as we go through our presentation today. So first, I'm not going into a ton of background because I feel probably most of you on this presentation are pretty familiar with what is dementia and what is caregiving. But we do know within the United States, over 11 million individuals are providing care for an older adult with dementia. And we know that there are many gains and growth that caregivers report experiencing with the care role. A lot of things that maybe they didn't have before that they grow through taking on this new role. But it's also very well known and established over years of research that caregiving can take quite a toll in terms of stress outcomes. We know that rates of both depression and anxiety are significantly higher among caregivers than their same aged peers who are not caregivers. And so there's been great interest in the field in trying to better understand what predicts these negative outcomes for caregivers, and then how we can develop interventions to improve outcomes for caregivers. And so for many years, and honestly, often still today, people held this very simple view of caregiving stress. So you think about what are the symptoms of dementia, whether they be cognitive, like memory loss, or behavioral, like agitation or aggression or apathy, some of these behavioral changes that can arise with dementia, or maybe even functional decline. So needing to help someone with dressing or with feeding themselves, some of these functional declines that can come with the disease. So it was believed for a very long time, and like I said, even still today, that there was a direct association between these symptoms of the disease and then outcomes that caregivers faced. So for example, the greater the severity of the dementia, the worse off the caregiver outcomes would be. But in fact, now for many years, there's been really a pretty surprising finding that that association is actually quite modest or quite small. It's there. It is significant generally that symptoms of the disease are related to caregiver outcomes. But again, it's smaller than you might think. And so there's something else going on here. And so that's where in the 1990s, Leonard Perlin's stress process model came into play that really built out this simple association a bit more. So you still see those objective stressors up in the top left circle, the symptoms that come directly from the disease. But then this model talks about how these symptoms can go into impacting other areas of caregivers' life. For example, family conflict. Maybe different siblings disagree on how to handle the challenges experienced with mom or dad. It may lead into problems with your work, financial problems. There's a variety of ways that these symptoms can then lead into other areas of impact in the caregiver's life. And also what this model points out is that caregivers look at these stressors differently. So for example, example, if an individual has urinary incontinence, this may be highly stressful for one caregiver. They may feel embarrassed. They may really feel very stressed when this occurs. Whereas for another caregiver, they may know how to manage it, and it really doesn't bother them, relatively speaking. So caregivers, there's a lot of variability in how they appraise and view these stressors. And then also everyone has resources that they bring into caregiving. So whether you have other forms of social support like family and friends who are helping you out in your care, these sorts of things can also impact outcomes that we see in caregivers. But what really has been understudied, in my view, is the process of how families are actually providing care. So how are they thinking about it? How are they viewing it in terms of their approach to care? And then what are their actual behaviors that they're taking when they manage day-to-day care and caregiving challenges? So this is really something we understand a lot less in the field. And so this gets me into my primary research question and our topic for the presentation today of caregiving styles. So first, if you think back to really seminal research from the 1970s, if any of you ever had a college psychology course, you may have come across this research before on parenting styles. So maybe you've been a parent. If you haven't been a parent, you've certainly had one. And so you can relate to this, that different parents approach parenting differently in the way that they respond to their children, in the ways that they discipline their children, in the ways that they show warmth. And so Baumrein's research back in the 1970s really showed that you could classify parents into different styles based on how they approached their parenting role. And then what was really incredible was that based on how you were classified into your parenting style, that was associated with a large variety of outcomes specifically for children. So for example, parenting style was associated with academic performance. It was associated with socio-emotional development in children. And so my research question is really fairly similar. Do family caregivers for individuals with dementia have distinct caregiving management styles? And can we profile them into these styles and then see if these caregiving styles are related to outcomes, both for the caregiver themselves and for the individual living with dementia? And so the long-term goal of this work is that by profiling these caregivers and understanding more about the way they think about care, the way they're acting in terms of their care delivery, their caregiving approach, if we can understand this better, we might be able to identify which caregivers are at increased risk for negative outcomes, or maybe which caregivers are at increased risk for potentially harmful caregiving behaviors that may negatively impact the individual with dementia. And then this can help us have more of a personalized or individualized approach to medicine and service delivery. So rather than a one-size-fits-all approach that we often see, broadly speaking, but also especially in caregiving, rather than this one-size-fits-all approach, which may be harmful. Some caregivers may not need intervention. Others may not need this particular type. So can we take this understanding of caregiving profiles and then better personalize the way that we work with caregivers? Danielle, I see you jumping in.
Yes, sorry to interrupt. I
It's
think
okay.
it's your speaker or the microphone. It sounds like we're getting a little bit feedback. I
Oh,
don't know if
really?
it's, yeah, if there was some
Okay.
rubbing up against it or not,
You know what?
but I
I'm
just want to
alone in the
correct it.
house, so I could try taking the speakers out and see if that improves things.
Okay,
Let's try that.
okay,
All right. Does this sound better?
that sounds good.
Okay.
Yep. All right.
We'll stick with this. Thanks for letting me know.
All right,
I'm sorry
great.
about that, everyone.
Thank you. Sorry about that.
Maybe my long hair rubbing up against the microphone today. Okay, so how did I go about studying this question of caregiving styles? So again, I have this funding from the National Institute on Aging for a Career Development and Early Career Research Award. And through that, we recruited 100 family caregivers for individuals with dementia. So these are primary caregivers, those who have the primary responsibility of care. They're unpaid, so they were either a family member or friend of the individual with dementia. They lived within 60 miles of Ann Arbor. This was because we did in-person interviews and also collected some saliva samples, which I'll talk a little bit about. And we were interested in individual caregivers who were providing like active hands-on care. So the individual with dementia could not be living in a nursing home or assisted living facility where the majority of their care would be there in the facility. And they needed to have a life expectancy of greater than 6 months or not be at the terminal stage. And so these interviews were conducted in 2018. They lasted for about an hour and a half. And based on our participants' choice, they were either in their homes or in a public place, like a coffee shop. We did do a lot of our recruiting through the MADC. So maybe some of you on this call even were among our participants or might be interested in participating in the future. So what did our sample look like? So our sample actually had a really wide age range, 20 to 90. So we had a handful of grandchildren who were primary caregivers, and then everything from adult children, daughters-in-law, sons-in-laws, niece and nephews, spouses. We saw quite the range, but the mean age you can see there is about 64 years old. The majority of our caregivers were women. The majority were white. And you can see, again, probably this being related to us recruiting in a college town, we had a highly educated sample of about 45% with postgraduate degrees. And so this is really one of my goals in moving this work forward, is to extend this work in a more diverse, both socioeconomic and racial ethnic sample. But for now, our caregivers provided on average 55 months of care. So they had been providing care for about 4.5 years on average. And they were working more than a full-time job in their caregiving role. So on average, 54 hours of weekly care. Again, you can see the relationship breakdown. The majority of these caregivers lived with the individual with dementia for whom they were providing care. And you can see, similar to breakdowns of dementia diagnoses, about half of our sample was caring for someone with Alzheimer's disease, and the other half had another diagnosis of dementia. Okay, so what I want to tell you up front is, because of our time limits today, I'm only sharing with you one piece of this big pie of my research, and I would certainly love to come back and share more or answer additional questions. So our study was actually a mixed method study, which means we had a qualitative portion with open-ended questions where caregivers could freely describe their stories and respond to questions. And then we also had a quantitative portion where we used validated scales, for example, on a scale of 1 to 5, responding to certain questions. And so today, for the sake of time, I'm just going to be talking about that one sliver of the pie. That's our qualitative research approach to answering this question of caregiving styles. And so what that looks like within our initial interview of 90 minutes, a portion of that interview was open-ended, where I asked caregivers to talk about caregiving challenge that they had faced recently. Often our caregivers were describing many challenges. They talked about why this was challenging to them, what was the challenge that was presented. And I had them really tell me the full story of these situations. What happened? Walk me through from beginning to end of what that challenge was, what it looked like, how you responded, how the individual with dementia reacted, sharing the full story. And then also I had them share with me their values and beliefs that they hold and that they bring into their caregiving role that may impact decisions that they make or how they respond to care challenges. And so because of one of my collaborators on this study here at Michigan, Daphne Watkins, we use the radar technique for qualitative analysis, which is an iterative approach to going through these transcripts of these interviews and narrowing down to the text that's relevant, and then coding and open coding and focus coding. I'd be happy to answer more questions about that process down the line. So iteratively, we go through the transcripts and look for themes and how caregivers group together in terms of their responses. And that's how we were exploring caregiving styles. But first, I thought you all might be interested in what these caregiving challenges were that our sample were describing. And so I have these classified as primary and secondary here. What that means is a primary caregiving challenge is something that a caregiver mentioned where they also talked about how they responded to that care challenge. What we often saw in our interviews was that caregivers would mention a lot of different challenges, but they would focus in on how they responded interacted based on one challenge. So if they mentioned it but didn't talk about their response, we classify that as secondary. But you can see really the full gamut of challenges here. The majority of these, or the largest proportion, were behavioral and psychological symptoms of dementia, such as agitation or delusions. Next, we had facets of cognitive decline like memory loss or executive dysfunction. We saw our functional impairment, like our activities of daily living. Caregivers talked about challenges with coordinating care, challenges with medical care, struggling with individual with dementia, coming to terms with their decline or losing their autonomy. And then we did actually have one caregiver say that they didn't have any challenges. So that was very great for them. All right, and so through this process of a qualitative analysis, we've identified 5 caregiving styles, and I'm really excited to share with you about them and what they look like. And so again, think back to that case study and see if you can see how those responses might align with these different caregiving styles that we identified. And this work is now published in the journal Dementia. So you could find that peer-reviewed empirical paper there in the journal Dementia. All right, so the first group that we found was called the Externalizer, and about 14 of our caregivers fell into this group. And so up at the top for all of these styles, I'm going to share with you like a characteristic quote for this group. And so this, a characteristic quote for this group would be, I'll say, if you think you're punishing me, you're only punishing yourself. And so what we saw in these transcripts or in our conversations with these caregivers, externalizers, was that they had a relatively superficial understanding of dementia. What I mean by that was, in words, they would recognize that dementia was the diagnosis, but they tended to view symptoms of dementia as being volitional or targeted towards themselves, the caregiver, such as, you're lying to me, your mother passed away 30 years ago, you know that she's been dead a long time. So struggling to come to terms with the fact that these symptoms are due to a disease and not something that the caregiver is the individual with dementia is intentionally doing. Externalizers took a very rigid or inflexible approach to care, so they tended to stick with one approach and only that approach, and they were not very adaptable. And their transcripts really talked about the stress of the caregiving situation to themselves, the caregivers, as opposed to the stress that that challenge might place on the individual with dementia. And then the common types of behavioral responses we were seeing in these transcripts were expressions of anger, frustration, and sometimes helplessness. And then this was quite interesting, but we saw that behaviorally and also in the way that caregivers were thinking about their approach was that they were trying to again and again bring the individual with dementia back into the caregiver's reality or the current reality. So, if they were to have a delusion or a hallucination, see or hear or believe something happened that didn't, they would, try to correct the individual with dementia and say, that is not there, that's not happening, trying to reel them back into the current context and reality. And so here's another quote that describes this group, the externalizers. So this caregiver says, sometimes if I say, no, that didn't happen, everybody has told me, don't argue, but I just don't like letting it go. We get home and I don't know if she tries to lie about it or what, she'll act like that never even happened. So again, you see this kind of view of the behaviors being volitional. And again, the caregiver says, everyone's telling me don't react this way, but they're just really struggling to come to terms with that and accept it. All right, our next group we call the Individualists, about 15 of our caregivers. And their characteristic quote is, you just live through it, you just do it. In fact, for the longest time, my team was calling this group the Just Do It group, like the Nike slogan, because that actual phrase, you just do it, came up again and again in these transcripts. And so these caregivers took a very direct, very linear approach to care, so somewhat similar to the externalizers in terms of the way that they went about things, but they tended to do it very independently. They took care entirely on their shoulders, and they saw a way to move forward when a challenge happened, and they just went with that. They transcripts were much more emotionally removed than the externalizers, who had a lot of frustration and helplessness. Individuals don't tend to bring their emotions into care. They just talked about what the challenge was and how they responded to it in a very direct way. If you saw any behavioral approach that really stood out in this group, it was using strategies to try and prevent this challenge from occurring in the future. So they would really try to, okay, if this happened, they're going to do something to prevent it from happening again, as opposed to coming up with like a variety of adaptive solutions to handle challenges. What was unique here was that even though they had a pretty straightforward, direct approach, they weren't very adaptable in terms of bringing in, a variety of behavioral approaches to care. They were managing very well without many challenges. It seemed to us as though this group hadn't really yet hit a wall where a challenge was beyond what they could handle as an individual caregiver. And so here's again another quote that's good for this group. So this caregiver is saying, I just go there and do it. It's part of my responsibility. It's what I have to do. And so when the interviewer asked them, have you tried any strategies that have made it easier for you over time, or have you ever changed your approach? This caregiver says, nope, you just go there and you do it. So you just take care of it. So again, as I said, a little bit of a lone wolf in terms of they tend to take care entirely on their own shoulders. Our next group was the largest. This is called the learner, and the learner was 35 of our caregivers. And their characteristic quote is, so as you go along, you stumble on a few things, but stumble it is. And so this group is, trying to address caregiving challenges and really trying to learn as they go. But in contrast with the individualist, they keep hitting a wall and getting stuck. So they're trying to respond when challenges occur. And then the way that they're responding isn't working for them. It is not helping them address the caregiving challenge. And you really see them on a spectrum between more maladaptive care practices and more adaptive care practices. What stands out most is that they were really using trial and error a lot. So they hadn't really developed an arsenal of strategies that was working for them. They were just trying whatever they could think of to see whether it would stick. And the problem was that often it wasn't. And so what you really saw from learners was insight that you didn't see in externalizers or individualists, that, maybe that approach wasn't working or wouldn't work forever. Learners fully recognized that the approaches that they were bringing to the table were not working for themselves, and they were really seeking help or trying to look for other ways to address challenges, but again, hitting a wall and not finding it independently on their own. And you see a large emotional range within the concept. So these caregivers, the learners, would talk about feelings of guilt, feelings of empathy for the individual with dementia. Sometimes they would be trying to temper their emotions, or they would feel helpless when their strategies were not working. So they're kind of on this spectrum. They recognize dementia, they know that these symptoms are not volitional, but they haven't yet acquired adaptive strategies for handling or managing. So here's a quote that I think shows this growing insight in this group. I just have to tell her there's something wrong, look at your feet. But then, this caregiver takes a deep breath and says, okay, she's not doing this on purpose. And so it's this growing awareness that it's not the fault of the individual with dementia, and it's the caregiver who needs to change their approach, but it's them trying to learn how to do that. Next, we have the adapter, and 17 caregivers here, and their characteristic quote is, always expect the unexpected. And what really stands out for this group is that they had a very large variety or arsenal of behavioral strategies that they brought to play within their care. And they really talked about kind of similar to what the learners went through. They learned over time, okay, this approach isn't working for me. And so here's what I've learned to try or do now because of things I've learned from my past caregiving strategies. Similar to the individualists, emotions were really not a part of their transcript. They seem to be pretty well balanced there, and they focus their energies not talking about the emotional impact of the challenge, but more all of the strategies that they would try on and what they would think about and what they would do when these caregiving challenges would occur for them. And so again, it's this accrued adaptability that they really learned over time as caregivers. And what's interesting is even though they have this large adaptive behavioral strategy kind of network that they can pull from when challenges arise, some of these responses were more positive and some were more negative. So, sometimes they would really try to reason with the individual and point out like, no, that's not correct. This didn't happen. But then other times they would use more adaptive strategies like diversion, diverting the individual's attention to something else, or, putting the blame on themselves was a really cool strategy I saw caregivers in this group do a lot, is they would say, I'm not feeling well. I think we need to leave the store. And maybe it was the individual with dementia who was getting agitated. So they would put it on themselves and help take the stress off of the individual with dementia. So they have a really large variety of strategies here. And I love, oops, I went backwards as opposed to forwards. I love this situation in this quote here. This was actually one of our grandchildren caregivers talking about caring for her grandmother who most mornings would wake up and think it was her day to go to the hair salon. That was something the grandmother really looked forward to. And she would always think, today is the day, we're going to the hair salon. And so she talks about, again here, all of the strategies for how she and her family would kind of deal with this with her grandmother. So sometimes they would hide her hair care stuff so it wouldn't prompt the memory of this being the day. Sometimes they would say, oh, you're right, it's not today, but it's actually in a couple of days, so we're going very soon. Or sometimes they would even pretend to do the grandmother's hair. So, get out the blow dryer, get out the brush, and give her a little bit of that salon experience so she felt like she was getting that, and then it would kind of appease her and they could move forward with the day. So you can see here again, she didn't just have one approach, she had a variety of ways that she could handle this challenge. Okay, and then our final group here, 15 caregivers, is the nurturer. And you can see their characteristic quote, I value making the most of what is present rather than what is lost. And so I think the nurturer probably contrasts most from that original group, the externalizer. So whereas the externalizer tended to focus on their transcripts on the stress that they themselves experienced with these care challenges, the nurturer on the flip side would really focus more on the impact of that care challenge on the care recipient or on the individual with dementia. So gosh, this must be really stressful for them and they must be experiencing, X, Y, Z. So they focused more on the other person than themselves. They had a lot of positive affect and they had a lot of self-efficacy or mastery that they brought with them as they approached care. I remember at least one or two of these nurturers was someone who was a nurse or a healthcare worker in their profession. And so they had kind of this history of being a caregiver. And they brought some of that with them naturally into their familial caregiving role. And they understood dementia well. They recognized symptoms stemmed from the disease and not something that the individual with dementia was doing to get a rise out of them, so to speak. And they would really enter into the lived experience of the individual with dementia, as opposed to trying to reel them back into the current reality. So one of my favorite examples of this for a nurturer was a caregiver whose husband was having hallucinations, recurring hallucinations of men in black suits and black hats coming into the house. And this would be alarming to her husband. And so rather than saying, there's no men in here, I don't know what you're talking about, this caregiver would actually talk to the men and say, you have to get out of my house, you're scaring my husband. She would open the door and like shoo the men out of the house. So she actually like dove right in and interacted where the individual with dementia was at. And the behavioral strategies you see a lot from nurturers, they use a lot of comfort, trying to make sure that the individual with dementia is comfortable and happy. And they talk a lot about teamwork, which I think is a unique aspect of this group. So, when the challenge arises together, rather than the individualist approach of going it alone and I just go there and do it, the nurturers would talk about how they would involve the individual with dementia and work together to overcome whatever the situation was. And so here you can see a characteristic quote for the nurture. I value her. I try to make her life be useful to her and fulfilling. I think she likes, I think she wants. So you really see the emphasis on the other person and targeting the caregiving towards the desires of the individual with dementia. And so again, here's the 5 groups. And so now what I'd like to do is share a little bit about what we're seeing in terms of distinctions between these groups, both in terms of demographic and care context variables, but also in terms of outcomes that are relevant to caregivers. So first, for our externalizer group, actually in terms of race and ethnicity, this externalizer group was made up 100% of Caucasian Americans. They were significantly older and had the largest proportion of spouses, of spousal caregivers of any of the groups. And then they were caring for the individuals with dementia that had the most behavioral and psychological symptoms of dementia. So they were caring for care recipients who had severe behavioral challenges, which are very stressful to deal with. So they were, frustrated and feeling some helplessness and, some anger in their care, but they were also caring for very complex patients. And then in terms of outcomes, like I said earlier on, in terms of our methods, one of the things we did in this study, and I wish I had time to tell you all about it, but we collected some saliva samples and assayed those for different physiological biomarkers in order to see how caregiving stress might get under the skin. And so cortisol is an HPA axis hormone that gets at physiological stress. And the AUC there stands for the area under the curve, which is just another way that we measure kind of the overall output over the course of the day of cortisol. And so we found significantly greater cortisol output, which would be associated with significantly greater physiological stress among externalizers compared to nurturers, the nurturer style. This group also reported the greatest caregiver burden, the greatest distress specific to behavioral and psychological symptoms. And this group also said that the individuals with dementia within their care had the lowest quality of life. So we saw some higher stress outcomes for this group. The individualists, something interesting here, 33% 1 in 3 of these caregivers reported difficulty in paying for their living expenses. And also we're providing care for the least amount of time on average of all the styles. And so, they had this pretty direct, straightforward, they could kind of go and take care of things on their own. And maybe that's because they hadn't been providing care for that long. So they were caring for individuals with dementia who maybe didn't need quite the extent of caregiving as some of the other groups. And maybe they took a more straightforward approach. If they were having difficulty paying for their living expenses, they had other things on their plate in addition to their caregiving role that also required more of their attention and resources. And this group, the individualist, showed the greatest upset about assisting with functional tasks, activities of daily living, and instrumental activities of daily living. Again, like helping with finances, managing medication, helping with dressing and meals, these sorts of tasks. Of all of the groups, they actually reported the lowest caregiver burden, and they actually had the same average score as externalizers. So they said the individuals with dementia within their care had the lowest quality of life among the styles. Okay, the learners, that group in the middle, they had the highest proportion of female caregivers in this group. Actually, 48% of learners were taking an antidepressant or anti-anxiety medication. So potentially, some mental health challenges within this group. And they were actually caring for individuals with dementia who had the lowest dementia severity rating scale severity. So in terms of dementia stage, if you want to think about it, or severity of dementia, the learners actually were caring for those who were the least advanced in terms of their dementia. So it makes sense that they were still learning and still kind of getting their feet grounded in this caregiving role. And actually, this group reported the least distress when it came to behavioral and psychological symptoms of dementia. Okay, the adapters, the one with the large arsenal of adaptive care strategies, makes sense. They've been providing care for the longest amount of time, on average 7 years. And so one of our interests as a research team is how can we get caregivers to this more adaptive caregiving style before 7 years have elapsed? Like, can we get someone there at year 1, year 2 to help them develop this adaptive behavioral responses to caregiving before they've been providing care for a very long amount of time? This was also the most highly educated of the caregiving styles. 70% of this group was using formal or paid for care services, so maybe their adaptability related to their comfort and seeking outside help. And this was also the style that had the largest proportion of non-white caregivers. And they were caring for individuals with dementia with the greatest dementia severity. So this, aligns with them providing care for a longer period of time. But in spite of caregiving for individuals with greater severity, they were also very adaptable. And they actually did not fare the best or the worst on any of our outcomes. So they were kind of in the middle on everything. So they were doing fine, but not the best, not the worst. And then finally, in terms of our nurturer group, 60% of this group was employed outside of the home. And so, maybe they were getting a little bit of respite from care with their work. And, as I said earlier on, in comparison with the externalizers, they had significantly lower cortisol output, meaning lower physiological stress. They also reported the lowest distress related to behavioral and psychological symptoms and functional care tasks. And they reported the highest quality of life among individuals with dementia across the styles. So the nurture group tended to be showing the best caregiving outcomes across the styles. Okay, so I'd like to end my time today to share with you all about how we can think about modifying our approach to caregiving services, caregiving interventions. And if you're a caregiver yourself on the call, you could think about, which of these styles maybe do you think you fall into now? And what are some considerations you might have in terms of ways you can grow in your care role? And so first off, I want to say, I think it's easy to hear my description of the different styles and say, oh, this is the best style, this is the worst style. And we actually don't think that way as a research team. Actually, we really believe that all of these styles have unique strengths that they bring to their caregiving role. And all of these styles have areas in which they can grow and improve in their caregiving role. And, when we're working with caregivers, the last thing, we want to tell someone is, oh, you're in this horrible style and you need to change. No, I think we want to help caregivers identify what they do well and then areas in which they can grow. And so when we think of the externalizer group, this is a group that's trying really, really hard to meet the needs of complex patients that have very challenging behavioral and psychological symptoms of dementia. And this group was actually really good at putting voice to and expressing what those challenges were for them and the difficulties that they were experiencing, which is really a great thing because oftentimes caregivers have a hard time pinpointing what they find difficult. And this group was really good at vocalizing or externalizing those difficulties. And so what we would tell caregivers within this externalizer group is you're not alone. There are other caregivers facing similar challenges that may be able to be a support for you. I think it's easy for this group to feel like they're in it all by themselves and everything is just on their shoulders when that's not the case. Also, we find analogies work really well for externalizers, such as, saying the pipes are corroding. So, there is a disease process that's taking place with dementia that is changing the cognitive abilities, the functional abilities, the behaviors of this person that you love. And so, acknowledging that and using analogies to help individuals wrap their mind around this disease process can be really beneficial. We feel externalizers would really benefit from respite or adult day service programs where it gives them a break and a time to really focus on themselves and rest and relax or get things done that they need to do. And then we feel advanced care planning would be really critical for this group. So I worked with a large variety of clinicians within our University of Michigan Turner Geriatric Clinic. So shared these styles with geriatric psychiatrists, social workers, nurse practitioners, et cetera, within our clinic. And got their feedback, and that's where some of these recommendations come from. But also, they told me that this is the group where we often see, caregivers bringing the individual with dementia like into clinic or into the emergency room when a challenge arises, when we would love to work more with them at home to help them resolve the situation before they rush into maybe emergency medical services. And so having a plan in place for when a crisis does arise can really help caregivers better respond when that does happen, because crises do occur. And so just being prepared for those moments. Okay, in terms of individualists, something that's really great about this group is they're very observant. Some of the clinicians told me individualists come into the clinic with like very detailed records of like the sleep schedule of the individual with dementia, like what they observed and at what time of day. They're really great at detailing all of that. And really effective, generally speaking, at getting things done. So as I described earlier, they weren't really hitting a wall. They were accomplishing things on their own. But we want to encourage this group not to miss the forest for the trees. There's an overall humanity of this person, of this loved one with dementia that we don't want to miss. And we want to maintain the personhood and not just think of charts and tracking symptoms and behaviors. And self-care for this group is huge, remembering they don't have to put all the responsibilities on themselves. There's maybe this feeling that I can get it done and I can get it done best. And yet you can't pour from an empty cup. And so caring for oneself is very important. Maybe pleasant activities would be a way to also, do something with the individual with dementia that's going to provide enjoyment for both parties. And so that's a recommendation for this group. Our learners, they're still growing in their understanding, and they're really willing to accept help, and recognizing that they may need help is a real strength of this group. And we feel that this is a group that would really thrive in behavioral interventions. One of those within our team is a We Care, which is a behavioral intervention for individuals with dementia to help them develop adaptive strategies for managing care challenges. So we feel this style would really thrive in that sort of a setting, as well as in support groups where they can, meet with other caregivers, bounce ideas off of one another, support one another, and problem solve in a group setting would be really beneficial for learners. And they should also know, trial and error is part of the learning process. Everyone goes through it, and you're helping yourself come up with strategies that are going to be adaptive for you over time. And because we saw a lot of emotional responses within this group, it's important to remember that sometimes just having an individual counselor can be really beneficial to share with someone on a regular basis the challenges with which you're going through. Our adapters, they understand dementia really well. They've acquired over time many behavioral strategies for caregiving that work well for them. But we want to remind them not to miss the joy in care. Look for the growth that you're experiencing. Look for those positive moments. If you remember, they tended to keep their emotion out of things, but there's also beauty there in caregiving. Humor can be a really helpful medicine, for example, and it's okay to express those emotions. And we feel like adapters could be a really great group to walk alongside other caregivers who may be struggling, or they might be great members of a support group, not necessarily because they need it so much for themselves, but because they could be really good to brainstorm and work alongside other caregivers. And finally, our nurturers. Some of their strengths are really still focusing on the abilities and what remains, what is still there for individuals with dementia, and on ways that they can grow and support that individual is a really nice strength of this group. And yet, they're really other focused. And again, it's important, just like we said, for some of the other styles, to care for themselves and remember that, they've taken on responsibilities and they need rest and they need rejuvenation as well. And so respite care may be one really beneficial service for nurturers to take some time out, to take some breaks, and get some time for them to focus on themselves as well. And so where are we going with this work before I stop and respond to some questions? I am currently interviewing caregivers for a supplement to this study where we're looking at caregivers' approaches and caregiving styles and how those vary during COVID-19. So are different caregiving styles responding differently in terms of how they're managing care in terms of social distancing and other COVID challenges? We're hoping to move this work forward in a more diverse sample that also incorporates some direct observation of caregiving styles. I'm really curious, whether we see this in formal caregivers, for example, nurses or assistants in long-term care facilities, and how their styles of care may impact residents in long-term care. And we want to continue this work and thinking about how we modify and tailor interventions and services and supports to caregivers based on their caregiving style to potentially have better outcomes and better effect for individuals. So with that, I like to thank you all so much for your time today. As I said, this was only one small piece of the pie of the work that we're doing on the study and my broader work, but it was a pleasure to be able to share with you. I'd like to thank my team, and most importantly, my participants. I don't know if any of you are on the call, but for caregivers who are in this 36-hour day of providing care and then take a chunk of their time to contribute to research is truly, truly meaningful. And I want you to know that we do not take that for granted, and we are inspired by you in the work that we do. So thank you so much. And I will take hopefully some time left to respond to questions. I can't hear you, Danielle.
There we go. Thank you so
There we go.
much.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
No
That was
problem.
wonderful information. Thanks again for sharing. So I'll just jump right into the questions that we have. Our first question is someone is a nurturer for their mom. And their dad seems like an externalizer, and she's nurturing for both of them and kind of concerned for her dad's physical health. So what can she do besides offer respite?
Oh my gosh. Yeah, that's a great question. And I mean, I didn't put that as an area for future study, but I'm very, very interested in caregiving networks and how families work as teams to collaborate on care. Because even though we're looking at primary caregivers oftentimes or usually are not, acting alone. And so I think these interrelationships are very, very interesting. And I think, exactly providing respite, of course, is important. But I think also, like I was sharing, maybe using some of these analogies to trying to present what's going on with mom in a way that her dad can understand, that will kind of sink into him, can be helpful. And, sometimes I think it's important to recognize that the way that we provide care has an impact on the well-being of the care recipient, but it also has an impact on us. And that's really what we're finding here is we're seeing outcomes, significant outcomes for both individuals with dementia and caregivers themselves. And so I think, one of my approaches would be, this is not just to do with mom, dad, this is also to do with you. And, I want you to, have a happy and healthy, end of life or later years. And so what are some strategies that, let's brainstorm together. Let's think through ways that, we can maybe make some changes to our routine that can help take some of the burden off of you and then also some of the stress off of mom. So, I think respite is a huge one, but, making sure that, the dad has an outlet, that maybe he has some pleasant activities in his day, some things that he can look forward to, and then using some, I would say, of these analogies to help him understand, to better understand or grow an understanding of what's taking place in dementia, and that what's happening to mom is a disease process as opposed to, something that she's doing to really bug bug the dad. So those are a couple of things that come to mind. But yeah, I think these interrelationships between the different caregiving styles can be really challenging. And one approach that we see that works really well for larger networks of caregivers, if it's not just a sole primary caregiver, but if we have like multiple siblings, multiple children, another, a spouse or partner, like if we have a team, sometimes what social workers can do, and I know they can do this within Turner geriatric clinics, is a family meeting where the whole family comes in and is with the social worker and talks through these things and brainstorms, what are the values and preferences of this individual and how can we work as a team together? And so sometimes if you as a child can't get through to your parent on your own, sometimes it helps to bring an understanding professional like a social worker into the conversation to facilitate some of those conversations and get some buy-in from all parties who are involved to help make the situation better. So that's another thing you could explore with your primary care physician or Turner geriatric clinics, like find a geriatric social worker. And I believe these types of family meetings are things that they do all the time.
Okay, thank you. Another question that we have, were there any surveys done to look at trait features of caregivers, so locus of control related, as to which more predictive of the specific caregiver type? So providers can be proactive in intervening with a more targeted support for the caregivers at onset?
Yeah, great question. So, locus of control was not one of our measures. However, we do look at associations between styles and personality characteristics and also emotion versus problem-focused coping. And we do see strong associations between these things. So, openness is a big personality characteristic that we see more in like the adapters who are open to trying different behavioral strategies, and we see less openness among the externalizers and individualists who have a more unflexible approach to care. So we do see some personality associations. Coping. So, there's emotion focused coping where we change the way that we think maybe emotionally about care challenges as opposed to problem focused coping where we take an active response to changing things in our environment. We saw more problem focused coping strategies being utilized by the nurturers and by the adapters than we saw by the externalizers and individualists. So we see some differences there. But one of the ways that I am actually next week submitting a grant that would help get us some funding to develop a measure for caregiving style. And that's definitely a next step for this work, is getting like a short scale that could be used in a clinical setting or by caregivers themselves to help them understand what their style is and help clinicians and researchers, better understand what the style is so that we can target and tailor our approaches more effectively. I think a lot of the clinicians I talked with, they said, like when I presented the caregiving style kind of format to them, they're like, oh, yep, this caregiver I work with is of this is of this. So it seems to really align with what clinicians are seeing, but we feel that having a short scale would be really beneficial to kind of help standardize that a bit. And so that's something we're working on, but we're not quite there yet.
Okay. All right. And just a few more. We're running out of time. So one question is if you can share a link to your article that's accessible to all, if you're able to do that. And then how could someone get involved in your current research if they're interested?
Oh, great.
And also, will this be a long-term study for the original caregiver participants?
Okay, great. Yes. So Danielle, you and I can connect about the paper. I need to double check the, the journal's rules on sharing, but I think it's available. Yeah. So I will touch base with Danielle, and that's something we could disseminate if possible. So right now we are actively recruiting for the COVID portion of this work. And you can find more information about that. It's publicized, I believe, through some of the MADC's publications, but also if you're familiar with the Health database, if you Google Health, that's a really wonderful database where clinical researchers across the University of Michigan, not just dementia specific, but for a wide variety of studies, will post their research studies and seek interested participants. Our study is posted there. And if you expressed interest, someone from our team will get in touch with you. So you could Google Health, and I volunteer on there all the time to participate in research studies because it helps me learn as well to participate in studies. And then, yes, so in this study, we actually did a 6-month follow-up. So what I reported on today was just the baseline interview, but we do have a 6-month follow-up because one of the things we're interested in is whether these styles can change naturally over time. And so that's something we're exploring. And then for this COVID piece of the work, we started by recruiting from our original participant pool, and we're able to get a good proportion of our original participants. And so that will almost be like, at this point, like a 2 to 3 year follow-up with some of those individuals. But then we're still extending recruitment beyond our original sample. But yes, so we do have follow-up, and we're interested in exploring changes and style over time, and also changes in outcomes over time. So TBD, maybe I could give another presentation about those questions later on.
All right. Well, thank you so much. We are out of time, and there was a request for a copy of a particular slide. So I'll speak to you about that
Okay.
one so that we can
Sure.
share it with someone.
Sounds good. Yeah, and I'm happy to answer additional questions if people have them, if they send them your way.
Okay, great, great. And then we can do that. So thank you all again, everyone, for attending. Again, I did place the link for the evaluation in the chat box. We appreciate the feedback. If you could just take the time to quickly fill that out, and you'll also get an email tomorrow with that link as well. So if there are any more questions, feel free to email me the questions, and we'll make sure that we get those answered for you. Again, thanks for coming out and joining us. Take care and stay safe, everyone. Have a good day.
Thank
All
you.
right. Thank you. Take care.